Good evening and welcome to tonight's edition of Fact Sheet Live on ETV. Every Tuesday evening here we discuss the facts without mincing words and ensuring that it's only the truth that's brought to the fore at the end of our deliberations. Throughout the entire month of January, our focus has been on the economy of Ghana and the prospects of the economy rebounding, regenerating after COVID-19's impact, which was felt in the year 2020. Tonight, we are staying the course of the economy, focusing our attention on the finance minister's previous budget reading he had given about the expenditure in advance of appropriation for the first quarter of the year 2021. And so tonight we ask several questions. Government has several plans for the year 2021. There are hospitals to be built, there's road infrastructure, there are schools to be built, there are debts to be serviced, and then our commitment towards public sector workers who are supposed to be paid. Over the years, it's been clear, abundantly clear, the government's expenditure, a lot of it goes into servicing of salaries and most of these issues. Tonight, my guest in the studio is someone who has been at the helm of affairs when it comes to the management of our economy. And we'll try to understand what's ahead of us as a nation per his view of things and then the budget as presented by the finance minister last year. Stay with us as we interrogate the issues of the economy, where our revenues are going to come from, the various ratings that have been given our nation, Ghana, the forecast per the revenue targets set by the finance minister, and the feasibility of ensuring these projects come to fruition. My name is Samuel Eshun, and I welcome you to the discussion tonight. And you're welcome back to Fact Sheets Live on ETV, live on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Tonight, my guest is the former finance minister under the John Mahama administration. Mr. Seth Terkper is my guest for the next 1 hour. Tonight, we are taking a look at the outlook of the 2021 budget, which was read for Ghanaians in terms of the first quarter of this country. Government's revenue targets, government's expenditure plans, government's ability to meet these plans that it's set for itself. The ratings from the World Bank and Moody's, Fitch, and the rest of the rating agencies. The outlook with COVID-19 still ensuring the nations around the world are brought to their knees. And Ghana, we know how the story is like, with the numbers going high and high and high, with government giving an indication. If we don't conduct ourselves well by complying to the protocols of the COVID-19, we might get another lockdown. I'll set the ball rolling with a quote from the finance minister, the former finance minister, who says, "Leadership of any nation succeeds or fails on the strength or weakness of how the economy is managed. A leader who cannot run the economy is a leader who can never be trusted to deliver. Leadership is about the economy and the character of the leader. It is about knowing how to grasp the problems, the expertise to find solutions, the courage to take bold decisions, the conviction to stay the course, the competence to get it fixed, the compassion to cushion the impact on the people, and the vision to create new and transforming opportunities for the people out of the situation." Mr. Terkper, good evening.
Good evening, and good evening to your viewers and to your listeners.
You're welcome. And let me say Happy New Year. Yes, it's been a while, long while we had a conversation.
Yeah, indeed.
All right, but I think it's appropriate that whilst we mourn our former president, John Rawlings, being the founder of your political party, I extend my condolence to you. But let me ask just quickly, what would you say is his legacy, former President John Rawlings?
Oh, I did a whole 1.5 hour show on his economic legacy. And if I may just try to summarize it, much of the framework of our economic management today is based on work done during the economic recovery program, structural adjustment program, era. And that is the legacy. This is the man who took a country that was oscillating in terms of negative growth, positive growth, that kind of up and down. And since 1985 until last year, when we were debating after 37 years of the country going into recession, stopped the recession, stopped negative growth. And that was a foundation that was laid since 1985 when it was stopped, till last year, having been through so many crises. And that is because even though the ERP SAP is vilified most of the time, with our adventure with the IMF, World Bank, it gave us a framework to determine when there is some problem with the economy and how to tackle it, either on our own or through the various austerity programs which the IMF came in to support. If you talk about the real sector, just to give you two examples, this was the man who set up GNPC, or GNPC was set up during his era with Chachu Chikata as the first chief executive, brought in the first rig, did most of the mapping that today has launched us into an oil era. Of course, thanks to President Kufuor for taking us also through the commercial phase, of it. But before then, remember, there was South Pond, which was to give us such great potential. The other example is cocoa farmers since 1993 have not had, to worry that when they buy their cocoa, there will be money in the budget to pay them. And that is because of the design of the cocoa syndication loan under the former chief of staff, Sir Newman, who was then at chief executive of Cocoa Board, when these things were put in place. And today Cocoa Board is able to borrow, to pay for the cocoa at LIBOR plus 2%, which not even a sovereign bond would have been able to do that. And so we can go on about the legacy. I like to look at, his economic legacy. Value-added tax and Kumi Preko. Value-added tax survived Kumi Preko and has become the most stable revenue source besides, income tax and tariffs, and that is because of the revenue administration and policy reforms that were put in place under the then National Revenue Secretariat, which culminated in the Revenue Agencies Board and what we have today as the Ghana Revenue Authority, which has consolidated IRS, VAT, and SEPS, which were all institutions within the civil service that were taken out of the civil service to strengthen revenue administration and to stabilize. And so today when you talk about countries that are able to generate revenue to cover their recurrent expenditure, and borrow only for capital, I think until 2 years ago, Ghana was one of them. Ghana, Kenya, I'm talking about African countries. So these are some of the legacies. You can talk about the foreign exchange regime,
Indeed.
forest bureaus, taking them out of cow lane and others, the black markets, and bringing them to the formal sector of the economy. All of these things came, during the period of the ERP SAP. Of course, he's known for launching us from military rule, to the Fourth Republic, of which he was also the first, president, and which has given Ghana some, civil administration, stability since the coup of 1966.
All right. So let's jump into the issues and discuss them. But we can't talk about today or tomorrow without looking back as to where we have come from.
Yeah.
Sitting as a former finance minister, watching the previous administration, and I mean the 4-year tenure of the President Dankwa Akufo-Addo's, rulership, let me put it that way. What would be your assessment of their management of the economy?
Yeah, let me say that I have said before, and therefore I can only repeat, that the management of the economy could have been better. And I say this against the background of the fact that, yes, we did have, coming out of the global financial crisis and coming out of, the slump in crude oil prices in 2015 and 2016, there were opportunities going to 2017. If I may mention first, the banking sector crisis that faces as a result of the global financial crisis and the falling crude oil prices, had a solution in ESLA. And to date, ESLA excuse me, by government's own projection, is estimated to bring about 41 billion Ghana cedis by 2024, 2025. And if the total estimation, of the liabilities for the banking sector, energy, and others, for which a slab was put in place, you can put it at maybe 24, 25 billion. That tells you that, there should be enough resources to have resolved substantially, some of the issues relating to that sector. Then you can also point to, crude oil prices having fallen and rebounded between 2016 and 2017 against the background of 3, oil fields, as opposed to 1. And the fact that if you look at this statistic alone, within 3 years of the administration, again based on the petroleum reports, the current administration has benefited from 56% of the revenue from oil production since 2011. So in 3 years, the administration has earned more revenue than the 8 years of the Mahama administration. And that is on account of Sankofa and 10 adding to, to Jubilee. So if you add this, you can talk about sinking fund, which was used from the oil revenue to take off, the first sovereign bond issued in 2007, that would have matured in 2017. The Mahama administration used 550 million US dollars of our oil revenue to pay off, a substantial part of, that bond. And when I say substantial, I mean it, because the bond is 750 million US dollars. If you paid 550 million, you are left with only 200 million. And in fact, that 200 million, of the 550 million, 300 million, approximately 336 was used by the Mahama administration, and 200 million was left in the kitty, and it was used to redeem the balance of the bond in 2017. We don't talk much about these opportunities, but this is an administration which one can say has had the most fiscal resources. And therefore, despite the challenges that we face, we cannot, I do not want to downplay the effect of COVID, and to think that we also had 1 billion, unlike other crises in the past. Few governments have faced crises apart from HIPIC, or the ERP SAP, where we got grants and others to resolve crises when commodity prices fall. The lead administration, in terms of crisis, 1 billion, US dollars from the World Bank, 1.7 equivalent from the Bank of Ghana, and about 400 million or so from the World Bank and others. So even the crisis that faces, unlike previous administrations, there were resources that flowed in, to resolve it. So if you look at all of these, just in short, you will see that's why I keep saying that, there were opportunities for us to probably have done better than we did with the economy, especially if you look at where we are today, 80% debt, approximately 15 to 18% deficits. That is a legacy which we are going into 2021.
With opportunities obviously come failings. What would you say were the failings of the government when it comes to the management of the economy for the past 4 years?
Well, we pointed out to some of them. Something which the Bank of Ghana and governor described as using the narrow basis for calculating the deficit. If you remember, instead of the broad basis, that is what we were calling the parallel numbers. So reporting a deficit that is supposed to be 4.7 when the IMF is telling you that that deficit is 7%. Reporting a deficit that's supposed to be 3.7 when the IMF is telling you it's 5.3% or thereabout. Or reporting a deficit again of about 4.5, when the IMF is telling you the deficit is 7.7. So it means that the impression that we were, consolidating, that is improving the economy using the narrow basis, and I'll explain the narrow basis for calculating the deficit, was not quite accurate, right? And that led to a bit of complacency and spending, particularly on massive consumption expenditures. of course, it was borne out eventually by debt. Because if your deficit, remember, when you talk about a deficit, like a household, the deficit or the deficiency in a household income is revenue coming from mom and dad, less expenditures. If you are fortunate, it will cover, the expenditures, that's the income.
Yeah.
If you are less fortunate and your income is low, your expenditure will be high, especially when you have to school periods like now, when you have to pay school fees, you have to send kids to school and all that. Or if you decide to buy furniture, if you decide to put up a house and whatever, those types of expenditures are very, heavy. And you may have to be paying mortgage, or you may have to be putting money aside to be buying blocks and other things. So when you run a deficit, you can decide that the deficit can be calculated in two ways. That's what we mean, just to simplify the narrow and the broad basis. You can decide that, oh, we started life and we had children and we were doing well. That is before they grew up and started attending school and expenditures came in. That is before you had a salary increase and decided to build a house. That is before you wanted to improve the furniture and whatever. So you can decide that those exceptional expenditures, right, which some are one time because the kid goes to school, you take a loan one time, you pay it off. Another term comes, you pay it off. You can decide that, your deficit or your borrowing can be calculated based on when you married and you didn't have children, when you didn't have school fees and other things to pay, and you didn't have exceptional expenditure like the banking sector expenditure or the energy sector expenditure, right? Leave out, mortgage and say that is not normal expenditure. After all, we don't eat mortgage, so. And calculate on a narrow basis and go around saying that you are doing well.
But is it an acceptable practice in terms of these formulations and calculations?
No, we have a very solid fiscal framework, very solid one. Again, we just spoke about from the ERP sub-days. And every government has faced one exceptional expenditure or the other. Every government. You can talk about the the fire that devastated cocoa farms during the Rawlings era. You can talk about drought, which every government, since Rawlings, since Nkrumah, the dam has faced. When there's droughts, it goes down, it affects agric, it affects power production, until we got the thermal plants, it was based on Akosomo. All these things, you can talk about subsidies, that balloon, you can talk about single spine. These big expenditures, they are the exceptional ones, and occasionally they come. And we put it in calculating the deficit, and then we plan to pay it, right? So if you say you are doing well and you take out those expenditures, despite whatever, and you are comparing your performance as 3.7 instead of 5.3, or as 4.5 instead of 7%, with a Mills performance, a Mahama performance, or a President Kufuor, His Excellencies, their performances. When they were using a broader basis, then you are just, and as to quote, the fundamentals will expose you. And that is what is exposing that methodology. And so we are going into 2021 under rather difficult circumstances. Yeah.
Let me take you back to the point you made about the opportunities that have availed itself to this administration, the oil production, and the fact that now we have more oil production, and we're making more revenue from that.
It's 70,000 barrels, 70,000 average. It was supposed to be 110. We never crossed 75,000 barrels per day. Under Mills Mahama, today we are doing nearly 200,000 barrels per day.
So you make that point to buttress the fact that government had more resources at its disposal to spend to ensure that we see improvement in our lives. But that's the point where you get to hear government, for instance, make the case that they settle substantial part of about 11 billion outstanding arrears bequeathed to them. You hear them talk about 12 billion in excess energy. These are places that they would make the claim.
Please, emphatically no. And I can show you, if we had a chance, I would have projected it. That was one of the complacencies. The 11 billion was reduced to about 7 billion, Ghana cedis debt. You remember the Auditor General saying that they rejected 5 billion of contracts. Those were the contracts. In the first place, one, no government had used those types of expenditure. We were compiling them to enable us to know what the ministries were doing as part of the GIFMIS. They had never been used to calculate the arrears. You know, so they added it, right? But what did they do? That gave you the 9.3, which incidentally, even His Excellency mentioned quite recently, but which of course was also based on the old GDP basis, right? What did they do? The 5 billion which the Auditor General was supposed to have validated, even before the Auditor General's work, you know, was done, was subtracted from the 7. And so what was carried forward was only 2 billion.
2 billion.
And I have the figures here. So that's the 2016 figure. And I'm quoting this from the Ministry of Finance website. In the end, on the current basis, the deficit that was carried forward was not 9.3 billion. The deficit that was carried forward on the new basis was 6.3 or 6.5%. And that is it. So 3 percentage points was screened off, right? But they kept repeating that we had left 11 billion. You know, remember the payments that were supposed to have been made.
But is that not where your members on, for instance, the Finance Committee of Parliament, who go through some of these?
Of course, they raised it. They raised it. You remember there was a SONA, and they raised it. They raised it. That's what we're calling the offsets, right? Those were the offsets. Of course, but the government continued and persisted in telling Ghanaians, just like it persisted in telling Ghanaians that the deficit is 4.7, even when the IMF is saying our deficit is 7.7%, right? Or saying that the deficit, if you look at the original budget, right, before COVID, we were supposed to have made a deficit of 4.7, and I'm quoting from page 107. You always have to go to the appendix to see this, right? Now, by the time the bailout costs and others were added, which are shown as footnote, the deficit rose to 11.4% in the revised budget, right? The IMF and others are saying this should be, 15% or so. So these are some of the distance. So I challenge anybody to show. Over time, of course, some of those arrears could have been paid, but they are not used to calculate. Let me tell you how the arrears are calculated. The arrears in the budget are calculated as, 6 months of bills that have been brought to the Ministry of Finance and remain unpaid by the Controller and Accountant General's Department, right? And there's one very interesting phenomenon. I think I even have it here. The table, if you can see it, the table 7, you can see it, appendix table 7. This appendix table 7 is what we used to calculate the 10 billion. Currently, and I challenge that they should bring out the figures. Currently, we have an appendix table 5 in the 2020 budget, which will ask ourselves whether the arrears was calculated on the same basis, because this was stopped, between 2018 and 2019 when we started to challenge it. 2020 they brought it back. Right.
But regardless, you would hear government make the case, and even in the projection for the 2021, where they speak about when they are doing a comparative analysis between your administration and then their administration just a year ago, where they make reference to the growth, the average growth rate, between their performance and your performance, and they make the case that yours was terrible.
No, of course. Well, first, 2 points. If you have 3 oil fields, what do you expect? We projected that the economy was going to grow already. So, you are stating a fact, which even the World Bank, IMF, and you can go back. Just as the IMF is projecting today, that because we are finding vaccines, because lockdowns are over, of course, some are coming back and all that, the global economy in 2021, which was like comparing 2016 and 2017, will grow. What's the difference? We came out of the global financial crisis. We came out of the fall in crude oil prices. So if you do not want to excuse, it's like the exceptional expenditure. If you do not want to excuse, right, the problems, the crisis that hit the economy, for which reason we set up the stabilization fund that was used for COVID, right, then tell Ghanaians that your performance, which has taken the economy into negative growth, don't make any distinction on account of COVID. Because when you go back, to President Rawlings, he had his bushfires, and then when you go back to President Kufuor, he had his droughts, he had his, remember that's when Bui was envisaged and whatever, and they also had those difficulties. Of course, they differ in severity. But remember, before COVID, the severest global crisis was supposed to be the global financial
But is that not
crisis.
where governance comes in and management comes in? I mean, the point about, let's say, the power crisis that hit us, it was not, we are not oblivious to the fact that, yes, we're heading towards danger, even at the time of former President Kufuor. And so then it becomes your responsibility as planners of the economy to have envisaged that, for instance, 2015, 2016, we're going to have that problem.
Precisely so. And we said that out of those experiences, we set up the stabilization fund. How come? And when we had the global fund, we took 215 million Ghana cedis, to help stabilize the economy. How come with 3 oil fields, we did not increase that fund? And the money that was taken, are you aware that the money that was taken out of the stabilization fund was substantially from the 1 oil field? Why didn't we envisage that the economy would definitely face crisis beyond this? And why did we use the oil money for consumption? Right?
In that respect, are you referencing the COVID-19?
Of course, I'm referencing COVID. COVID is a crisis.
But this, yes, it's a crisis, but this is a crisis you could not have envisaged.
Could you have envisaged the global financial crisis?
Well, for the readers of the market.
I'm asking a simple question. Yes, we could not have envisaged, right, COVID. I don't have any question about that. But could you have envisaged the global financial crisis?
But we could have envisaged, for instance, the power crisis that hit us. Could we not have envisaged the power crisis that hit us in 2015, 2016?
Yeah, could you have envisaged that the pipeline would be broken? Remember the source of the power?
I could have envisaged.
Excuse me. I'm taking your point.
That's fine.
I couldn't envisage COVID. You are asking about power crisis, and I'm asking, could you have envisaged that a pirate ship, right, a pirate ship will break, the pipeline from Nigeria to Ghana, and for 2.5 years we will not have gas?
Not at all.
Of course. So what is the difference in envisaging? Where's the magic? Where's the magic that I could have used to envisage a crisis which this government could not also have used to
in that respect, I'm talking about the power mix. When we knew that hydro obviously was going to fail us.
Of course, remember by the time we had the crisis, we had put up thermal, the trouble. And remember the CDB loan was criticized heavily, right? But I can assure you that before the thermal crisis, right, that's another preparation that was made. Just as I mentioned, President Kufuor anticipated, just as I said that President Kufuor also anticipated and said, okay, let's have breeder to complement Akosomo, right? We had gas, and we said we wouldn't flare gas, right? We said we wouldn't flare gas, and we took a loan to do the thermal plant. So what preparation did we do, in this era? That's the question I'm asking.
Okay.
You can ask yourself. So I'm saying that the point we are making, let me go back to a household.
Yeah.
Nobody can envisage that a child will fall sick.
Indeed.
And nobody can envisage that the sickness will be measles, for which you know the solution, or it will be COVID, for which you don't even have a vaccine. Right? Despite the severity, I'm saying that every parent should know that there will be a time children are vulnerable, and there will be a problem, right? And therefore, you should prepare and put some money aside so that immediately, even the child falls and breaks a leg or something, you pick your car and you take them to the hospital, or you put the child on the back, pick a taxi or something, right? So it's the same as managing an economy. So I don't think we should excuse, right? I'm not downplaying COVID at all, no. But I'm saying that we should not say one government should have envisaged crisis facing the economy, and another, could not have envisaged it. No. The point I'm making is that every economy, but I'm saying, right, again, that the most important point is that out of the previous crisis that we face, we said oil is new to the economy. So let us use oil to resolve some of the problems and not use all the money for traditional expenditure. All the money for traditional expenditure. You remember the debate about Heritage Fund, which we could have used. Remember the debate 3 years ago?
Indeed.
You remember the debate about stabilization fund, that let's sweep the stabilization fund. Where would we have been in COVID if we had swept the stabilization fund, 3 years ago? After all, we fed on the stabilization fund as a first opportunity before we even got the IMF loan. We went to Parliament. And that's a structure that is put in place to prepare you for crisis. That's the point I'm making.
All right.
But the important thing is I hope we can look, ahead.
Yes.
And why, Fitch, Moody's, and all the rest are saying that we are in for hard times.
That's where I'm taking us to, and that's the general outlook. How do you predict our performance is going to be as an economy, looking at COVID-19 and the fact that numbers are still going up, looking at the fact that in terms of our trade with our partners, virtually, some countries we are still not being able to trade with. A lot of our taxes we are getting from, imported goods that come into the country. Business is a little bit slow. Government has projected that it intends to rake in some 66 point something billion within the first quarter. Are these feasible, and is it stimulation of the economy, the path for us to grow, or is it about fiscal consolidation?
Now, I think the way to look at this, right, is let the numbers speak for itself.
Okay.
The numbers you are speaking, you are talking about is here, right? So in 2018, we collected 47.6 billion. In 2019, we collected 54.6 billion. These were all below the budget estimates that we said we would collect. In 2020, as you pointed out, the original estimate said that we would collect 67 billion, 67.1 billion. Excuse me. When COVID hit, like 2016, when we had to reduce our revenues because you are not going. Remember 2016, we went to Parliament 3 times to reduce. There's nothing new under the sun. Yeah. Right? The government, to its credit, went to Parliament and reduced the 67 billion to 53.7 billion because of the crisis.
Okay.
So here is an economy which has never raised even 55 billion, right? These are projected. The actuals, the highest we raised was 54 billion. And we reduced it to 53 billion. So it means that the 67s we said we'll collect, now we are saying by the end of this year, and the numbers will come out when the budget is ready, we shall bring only 53.7 billion. Now the figure you are quoting, in the expenditure and appropriation, we are being told that we shall collect 66.5 billion. You see the jump? Yeah. Now come to expenditure. Remember we were comparing revenue, expenditure to give you the deficit. Okay. Whilst you were reducing revenues, right? In 2016, we reduced expenditure as well. Whilst you were reducing revenues, we were seriously increasing expenditures. Okay. Okay. So 2018 again, expenditures were 58.2. 2019, expenditures went up to 70 billion. In the budget for 2020, it went up again to 84.5 billion. You see the gap? Because then when the revised budget was done, whilst we were reducing revenue, as I said, we increased the 84 to 96.3 billion expenditure. Creating deficits. A wider deficit. In fact, the deficit increased from estimate from 4.7% to 11.2% on account of this big jump. Now we are being told that we are going to collect we are going to spend 103 billion. And this will give us a deficit of about 8.1. First question. Revenue has stagnated. You can see. In fact, if you look at it in terms of GDP, the highest revenue performance in terms of GDP occurred in 2015. Expenditures have been going up. So the deficit is going to widen. And when the deficit widens, it means borrowing is going to go up. And that's how can we hit, because the expenditure has gone up, while the revenue was going down. That is why our, because energy, remember, the increase was not on account of only COVID. It was an account of energy cost that was taken out, bailout cost that was taken out. And if you look at the expenditure in advance of appropriation, energy costs and bailout costs are not part of these expenditures. They were not included in the expenditures.
Do we have the space to, for instance, borrow, if we are talking about constant decline in revenue targets and inability to meet them with expenditure going up, that's increasing the deficit. Do we have the space?
Well, we can go back to Fitch. We can go back to Moody's. That's the warning they are posting. Now with the expenditures rising and hitting 80%, it will be difficult for you to go to the markets. Why? Because we are spending, over 100% of our tax revenue, more than 100% of our tax revenue, on 2 expenditure items only. Right? That is compensation and interest payments. We are not even talking about repayment of debts. Again, I'm quoting from the government's own data. We are not even talking about repayment of debt. So we are borrowing to pay either compensation or interest. And then we are going to borrow to pay capital expenditure, which is not covered. And we are going to borrow, also to service the debt, because remember, it's only interest. And this is already over 100%. So they are looking at these numbers, and they're saying, if you take on more loans, are you going to use 200% of your tax revenue, to pay? And in fact, it's almost 100% of total revenue. And remember, it's total tax revenue before you have taken out GET Fund, NHIL, and the rest. Right. So this is the basis on which, Moody's and others are posting their warning. All right. So if I quote it, it might, I had already said, that we may hit 80%. I think I had already said that the deficit might be 15%. By computation before some of these agencies started.
We will go for a break, but when we come back, we would want to establish the schools of thought about debt to GDP and its implication on economies, because there's that reference that is usually made. Look at China's economy and its debt to GDP. Look at America's economy and its debt to GDP. So some people make the case that, look, regardless of your debt to GDP ratio, if you have the capacity to service your loans, it's not a matter for concern. When we come back from the break, these are areas we are going to look at. We'll try to establish the correlation between the macroeconomic indicators, because if you look on the surface of the books, they look good. But how does it reflect in terms of our day-to-day lives and activities? We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is Fact Sheets live on ETV, live on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can join the conversation with your thoughts, your views, and your comments. If you share them with us, I'll gladly read them. Our WhatsApp line is 02022222067. Any question at all you have for Mr. Terkper, former Finance Minister under the John Mahama administration, sharing his views on the outlook of the Ghanaian economy, especially being a man who has managed our economy before. So I was asking the question earlier about the theories about debt to GDP and the fact that some make the case that it doesn't matter whether your debt to GDP is around 90%, whether it's around 120%. Most important is the ability of the economy to sustain the repayment. Is that not the angle we should be looking at?
You see, you're talking about rich countries, and you're talking about poor countries. Let's come home. You have a neighbor, right? You are an employee. You earn salary only, right? Obviously, because you are poorer, right? You may be middle income, but you may be poorer than your neighbor who is what? A businessman. who has 10 houses and has a business which is flourishing, right? Then you tell yourself, I can compete with my neighbor in terms of expenditure. I can also buy a Benz, right? I can also take, my children. That's why the state comes in to support poor people, and that's why IMF, World Bank, and others come in to support poor nations, right? And then you go and borrow. You go on a borrowing spree, right? And all of a sudden, the GDP is your income. Basically, that's what it means. Let's simplify it.
Yeah.
And then you find out that the debts you are borrowing, of course, you started with you are not that bad even in life, and therefore you can also go out with your car, Hyundai or whatever, neighbors see you, you are in an accommodation, you haven't even finished paying your mortgage. It's not like your neighbor, who is rich, competitive, and therefore even the houses are paid. They were probably built from profit that they made and everything. They are import business, they are whatever, right? And then, somebody, maybe your bank manager cautions you and say, hey, wait a minute. It appears your borrowing is going up. You're at 80%. And then you say, oh, my child just came from school and said it doesn't matter because our next door neighbor,
it's also around 80%.
Can borrow around 80%. Which of you can sustain, their debt better? You see the fallacy in what we are talking about?
But is that not where the macroeconomic indicators come in? When we are being told that inflation is at a single digit, when we are being told that depreciation is an all-time low, when we are being told that our economy is doing well, policy rate is coming down, 14.5. These are all indicators that should tell us that we're doing well.
No, of course. I'm saying that when you had your 3-bedroom house and you were paying your mortgage, right, and you were driving your car, modestly and going to work and coming back, you were doing well. At least you were doing well than a messenger in your office. Life is relative, right? And you're also doing well, right? And that is why the government taxes you more and taxes your neighbor even more to support, those who, who are below you. And I'm saying nations are the same. We shouldn't delude ourselves. Countries are the same, right? So are we saying that when the crisis hits, did anybody go and give aid to them? When COVID hit, did anybody go and give aid to America? President Biden just signed 1.something trillion support. Of course, if you can borrow to their levels, then you can also write a check. But see whose bottom line will be affected most. Right?
So in that respect.
So I'm saying that, wait a minute. So I'm saying that just like, those macro figures. What are the macro figures for a household? It's your income, right? It's your expenditure. And you deduct the two, right? And your macro figures are the borrowing, because your income will never, and plus your mortgage, your exceptional ones and the rest. And they are the same as your rich neighbor, right? What are his basic, of course they also eat, except that they eat maybe more sumptuous meals than you eat. But in macroeconomics, food is food, isn't it? Right? So if you are classifying, you classify food. The child may be going from Ghana to Cambridge, to Oxford, to Harvard, and whatever. They are paying themselves, right? Is the expression fees any different from you taking your child to asking your child, hey, you work hard, one day you will also be like, that's the best you can say.
What is the danger for a home like the picture you are painting for us, and in that respect, Ghana, to have a GDP of 80%?
We know the consequences.
What is the consequence?
The consequences I'm saying is that your bank manager is warning you because, maybe you go to the same bank, right? You and your neighbor. Maybe the bank is just next door. And then the bank manager knows of all of you, both of you. So when you tell your bank manager, oh, my child says, we are just about 80%. And our next door neighbor is also about 80%. 80% of what? Right? 8 divided by 10 is 80%. 80 divided by 100 is what? 80%. 800 divided by 1,000 is what? 80%. Right?
So
and therefore, you know, 8 billion divided by 10 billion, and that is just as households are tiered. The world is also tiered according to countries. And so the ability of Japan to go and borrow and be able to weather an 80 because their economy is resilient, you know, immediately COVID, they are the ones finding the solutions for the vaccine. Are we finding any solutions for vaccine?
In that respect, can the Ghanaian economy withstand any vulnerability, stress, pressures?
We would not have declared HIPIC. Otherwise, because
are we anywhere close to HIPIC? Is there a likelihood of we going for HIPIC again?
Let's get the fundamentals. Let's finish this explanation. I'll come to HIPIC. I'm saying that at the time we were declaring HIPIC, when our debt was over 100%, right? Japan had debt which was also over 100%, and some countries also had debt which were. And I tell them, yes, it is true that we have 80%, right? And it is true that because of COVID, other countries also have 80%. But what is the 80% representing? 80% of what income? What level of income? What level of GDP? 80% of what economy? An economy with factories, with financial markets where we go and borrow. They don't come to our stock market to borrow, do they? Right? So I'm saying that the lesson is, let's be realistic, right? And not compare ourselves, right? Compare ourselves to countries that have the wherewithal, to borrow, and that is because they have a strong economy. Because when the economy rebounds, they are the ones who are going to produce, and we are the ones who are going to import. And whilst we are facing, crunch, they are earning income from their exports.
All right, so
until we have retweaked the economy, such that we will also becoming like the China, which used to be poor, the Brazil, which used to be poor, right? And South African countries can also begin to implement some of, we don't have to reinvent the wheel, some of the policies that they implemented, which says that when you borrow, you must pay down so that you can go and borrow again. You don't borrow and defer it for 10 years, 15 years, 40 years. That is what we're doing. We paid Akosombo Dam. It took 40 years to pay Akosombo Dam. Right? But we are saying, no, now we have oil. Now we have something extra. So let's also pay back as rapidly as the other countries do, because that is what they do, and that's why they're able, to pay at 80%. To borrow at 80%.
It's unfortunate, but our time is far exhausted. We have just an hour. But there's a question I want to ask, and that has to do with, the finance minister's name, the former finance minister's name has come up as, the candidate to, be the person to man the affairs of our economy. What advice would you give him in terms of the direction he must take the economy?
I think I've written sufficiently on the economy, and especially now that, in fairness to him, now that he's going to the appointments committee, I wouldn't want to be pontificating or doing anything. I believe that, he's qualified, right? And he's run the economy. Are you
happy about how he managed the economy?
I just said that as a government, we could have done better, right? And I'm mindful of the fact that we also had difficulties, right? But if at the end of the year, despite the crisis, and of course, there's always the tendency to take refuge in the severity of COVID and the rest, we would see whether, I believe that the lesson that we should learn is that the economy will go through crisis. Ghana's economy will go through more and more crisis, because it's like the US, every economy will go through crisis. And we should be modest in admitting that somebody's crisis may be smaller or larger than mine. But the important thing for both of us running the economy is to prepare the economy to manage crises better when we have more resources. And that is done through something called stabilization funds. It's done through something called sinking. That is what the advanced countries are doing, and that is why they are ahead, ahead of us. I
have 3 minutes, but under 1 minute. If internally our revenue targets are not being met, now, you're talking about debt to GDP portfolio also going high, which we can't also go there. What then do we do since we can't generate internally?
Like our neighbor, we shouldn't pretend that we can do what they are also doing, or even doing things which they are not doing. Our rich neighbors are not doing some of the things that we are doing.
But there are manifesto promises to be met.
Pardon?
But there are manifesto promises to be met.
The consequence is 80% debt. And I think as Ghanaians, we must, be realistic, where certain policies will land us. We left at 57%. We are now at 80%. 2016 was 57%.
Do you foresee us going back to the IMF for help? Do you foresee us going there?
If we do not implement our own homegrown policy, to use the expression, to take control of the deficits, we'll end up there. Why do we end up there? When we had single spines, the reason we went back to the IMF, it only took a couple of big development partners who give us money for the budget, saying that we are not going to give you money for your budget until you go to the IMF. And we had to go to the IMF, including the World Bank.
I'm grateful tonight for making time to join us on Fact Sheet.
Thank you very much, and I hope that has been beneficial to us.
Yes, and we're hoping that we will get the opportunity to engage and interact on some of these issues moving forward. But my guest has been the former Finance Minister, Honorable Seth Terkper, sharing his thoughts with us as to the outlook of our nation, Ghana. My name is Samuel Eshun, and this has been the Fact Sheet. There'll be a repeat, play of the show tomorrow, God willing, at 10 a.m. But I'm grateful you made time to join us tonight. On behalf of the team, I'd like to say a big thank you to you.